Have you ever noticed how the illusion of luxury completely short-circuits basic logic? Put 3,000 people on a floating resort, remove their daily routines, and watch the extreme entitlement emerge. These are 12 real documented situations where the anonymity of a cruise ship allowed passengers to unleash a level of sheer audacity they would never attempt on land. 1. Have you ever met someone who thinks paying for a premium suite makes them a majority shareholder of the maritime industry? Allow me to introduce Robert, a retired orthodontist from Connecticut, who boarded a brand new 4,000-passenger vessel with the unshakable delusion that he had simply chartered a very large, slightly crowded private yacht. Robert didn't just have vacation requests, he had strict operational directives for the crew. On the morning of day 2, he bypassed the standard guest services line entirely and confidently marched up to the suite concierge, sliding a meticulously typed 3-page itinerary across the marble counter. It wasn't his personal shore excursion schedule, it was the ship's new sailing agenda. Robert had used a maritime weather app to calculate the optimal cruising speed to ensure his aft-facing balcony didn't experience wind resistance exceeding 12 miles per hour, and he formally requested the captain reduce our current speed to exactly 14 knots. When the deeply perplexed concierge politely explained that international shipping schedules cannot be altered simply so a man can read his morning newspaper on the balcony without the pages fluttering, Robert immediately escalated the situation. He demanded a direct, unmonitored phone line to the bridge, citing that on his friend's 90-foot yacht in Cabo San Lucas, the captain always consulted the VIP guests before touching the throttle. By day 3, Robert's private yacht fantasy evolved into pure geographical entitlement. He realized the afternoon sun was hitting his suite at a suboptimal angle during his scheduled cocktail hour. So he dialed the emergency ship-wide directory, finally getting a bewildered deck officer on the line, and calmly instructed the bridge to rotate the 150,000-ton megaship precisely 45 degrees to starboard and just idle there for an hour, so his wife could get proper golden hour lighting for her Aperol spritz. The officer genuinely thought it was a medical emergency, until Robert clarified that the real tragedy was the shadow falling across his artisanal charcuterie board. When told the ship was currently navigating a designated shipping channel and could not perform a synchronized swimming routine for his balcony, Robert didn't yell. He just sighed, the deep, exhausted sigh of a billionaire forced to fly commercial, and asked if the ship's engineering team could at least deploy 2 of the lifeboats to tow the vessel slightly to the left. He spent the remainder of the cruise leaving handwritten performance reviews of the captain's steering abilities under the door of the guest relations manager, deducting half a star every time he felt a wave. 2. Susan, a boutique owner from Scottsdale, approached the main deck hot tub on a bustling sea day with the energy of a woman arriving at her own master bathroom. She possessed that specific level of entitlement that occurs when someone decides public amenities are simply private facilities that other people haven't vacated yet. The hot tub was currently occupied by 6 chatty passengers enjoying their afternoon. Susan didn't complain, and she certainly didn't wait her turn. Instead, she placed a waterproof Bluetooth speaker on the rim, blasting a Gregorian chant meditation track at maximum volume, and proceeded to empty a massive, family-sized bottle of lavender eucalyptus bubble bath directly into the churning jets. As a mountain of aggressively scented foam rapidly expanded, suffocating the personal space of the 6 strangers, Susan stood by the edge in her silk robe, calmly holding a glass of champagne. When a coughing man from Chicago asked what on earth she was doing, Susan serenely informed him that her travel agent had booked her the spa immersion package, and her private soak was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Within 3 minutes, the hot tub looked like a washing machine that had swallowed a stick of dynamite, and the 6 passengers fled the lavender tsunami. Susan smiled, dropped her robe, and stepped into her newly conquered, eye-wateringly fragrant domain. Her victory lasted exactly 4 minutes before a maintenance crew arrived to shut down the pool deck, draining the tub and handing her an invoice for environmental hazard cleanup. 3. A tender port in the Mediterranean is a massive logistical operation requiring patience, a virtue entirely absent from the DNA of a tech developer named Marcus. Marcus did not do lines, and he certainly didn't share boats with people wearing matching family reunion t-shirts. Arriving at the boarding area on deck 2, he observed the queue of 200 people, scoffed audibly, and bypassed it entirely. He walked directly up to the ship's security officer, pulled out a stack of pristine $50 bills, and stated he would like to charter the next tender for a private transfer. The officer politely explained that the tenders were public shuttles, not personal water taxis. Marcus, assuming this was merely a negotiation tactic, peeled off 3 more 50s and offered to buy out the entire seating capacity, promising he wouldn't mind if the driver went faster to make up time. When the officer firmly denied the bribe, Marcus pivoted. He turned to the massive line of waiting passengers, held up the cash, and loudly offered $20 to anyone willing to step out of the queue so he could have the boat to himself. He managed to successfully bribe exactly 4 college students before a very unamused deck manager personally escorted him to the absolute back of the line. 4. If you want to witness peak megaship delusion, you must observe what happens when someone decides a sprawling public venue is actually their own personal living room. Enter Eleanor, a formidable matriarch from Dallas who booked a mid-tier balcony cabin, but possessed the unearned confidence of a European monarch. On the second morning of a 10-night cruise, Eleanor discovered the observation lounge on deck 15. It was a massive, panoramic room with floor-to-ceiling windows, plush armchairs, and a quiet atmosphere perfect for reading. Eleanor surveyed the 5,000-square-foot space, nodded to herself, and essentially planted a flag in the carpet. She decided this was her private penthouse extension. Her hostile takeover began with interior decorating. She dispatched her husband to their cabin to retrieve their own decorative throw pillows, a highly specific orthotic footrest, and several silver-framed family portraits, which she meticulously arranged on the premium coffee tables at the very front of the lounge. Once her nest was built, the territorial defense commenced. Whenever another passenger walked into the lounge to enjoy the ocean view, Eleanor would loudly clear her throat, tap her watch, and inform them they were trespassing on a private VIP event. If they ignored her, she would physically move heavy ship armchairs to create an impenetrable fortress wall around her seating area, glaring at anyone who dared look at her framed photo of a golden retriever. She even swiped a caution wet floor cone from a janitor's cart, draped a stolen bathrobe over it, and positioned it at the entrance of her quadrant like a makeshift security guard. For a solid 48 hours, her sheer, aggressive audacity actually worked. People are generally non-confrontational, and most passengers just slowly backed out of the room rather than argue with a woman aggressively polishing a silver picture frame in a bathrobe. But the inevitable collapse of her empire came on day 4, when the cruise line actually did need the lounge for a scheduled trivia event. The entertainment staff arrived to find Eleanor demanding they lower their voices in her drawing room. Guest services was summoned, her decorative pillows were politely but firmly placed into a laundry cart, and she was informed that public lounges are, in fact, public. Now, a normal person would accept defeat. Eleanor was not normal. This is where the situation escalated from mere entitlement to a masterclass in petty revenge. Realizing she could no longer physically claim the territory, she decided to financially occupy it. Eleanor marched down to the casino bar and quietly recruited 6 guys in their late 20s who were clearly on a very loud, very aggressive bachelor party trip. She offered them a highly lucrative contract. She would open an endless tab and pay for their unlimited buckets of imported beer for the rest of the voyage. In exchange, their only job was to occupy the 6 premium seats at the front of the observation lounge from 10 in the morning until midnight, ensuring no other adults could ever enjoy the panoramic view she was denied. It was a flawless, spiteful strategy. The groomsmen gladly took the deal, planted themselves in the velvet armchairs, and acted as Eleanor's proxy army. She would occasionally walk by just to smirk at her successful blockade. But Eleanor drastically underestimated the chaotic nature of an unsupervised bachelor party with unlimited alcohol. By day 7, the 6 men realized they possessed the best real estate on the ship and a patron who was blindly funding their beverage consumption. They stopped sitting quietly and started inviting everyone they met at the pool. The 6 guys became 25 guys. They brought massive Bluetooth speakers, started a sprawling, incredibly loud table tennis tournament using the premium coffee tables, and essentially turned Eleanor's sacred, quiet sanctuary into a chaotic, sticky, deafening sports pub. When Eleanor finally marched in, completely appalled, To demand they lower their voices and respect her sponsored territory, the bachelor completely ignored her complaints, loudly cheered her arrival, and enthusiastically tried to hand her a lukewarm light beer. She spent the final 3 days of the cruise avoiding Deck 15 entirely, utterly displaced by the very mercenaries she had hired to defend her honor. 5. Let's be honest about the ship's public address system for a moment. The captain's noon announcement is a sacred maritime tradition designed to keep thousands of people safely informed. Well, Derek from Austin treated this ship-wide broadcast like an incredibly annoying telemarketer that had somehow bypassed his personal spam filter. On day 3 of an Alaskan itinerary, while the captain was pleasantly detailing our current nautical speed and pointing out a pod of whales off the port bow, Derek picked up his cabin phone and dialed guest services with the furious energy of a man canceling a cable subscription. He didn't just complain about the volume. He formally requested to be permanently unsubscribed from the bridge's mailing list. The incredibly confused representative spent 5 minutes trying to explain that the speakers were hardwired into the ceiling for safety and general information, and it was physically impossible to mute a single cabin. Derek, whose tech bro entitlement ran deeper than the Mariana Trench, refused to accept this. He demanded to know exactly where the optical sensors were located in his ceiling so he could cover them with tape, and firmly stated that he did not consent to being aggressively educated about barometric pressure before his morning espresso. He ultimately submitted a written grievance accusing the captain of unsolicited acoustic harassment and demanded a prorated refund for the 7 minutes of vacation time he lost listening to someone else talk about the weather. 6. A modern megaship features an outdoor LED movie screen roughly the size of a suburban driveway, designed for communal evening blockbusters. Now, I want you to imagine the sheer, unadulterated confidence required to view this multi-million-dollar cinematic installation as your personal PowerPoint projector. Enter Greg, a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, who viewed a relaxing sea day not as an opportunity to unplug, but as a chance to optimize his workflow. Right in the middle of a crowded afternoon screening of a popular superhero movie, with hundreds of people floating in the pools and eating soft-serve ice cream, the massive screen suddenly flickered, cut to black, and displayed a blindingly bright pie chart titled Q3 Synergies and Acquisition Targets. Greg had actually managed to stand near the DJ booth, bypass the protective casing of the multimedia console, and hardwire his titanium tablet directly into the ship's primary broadcasting feed. As a collective groan erupted from the hot tubs, Greg simply turned his back to the pool, clicked a tiny presentation remote, and loudly began rehearsing his board meeting pitch to the empty air in front of him. When the frantic entertainment staff rushed over to physically unplug his device, Greg didn't even flinch. He just held up an index finger, calmly stated he was in the middle of a massive quarterly review, and offered the technician a crisp $100 bill to give him just 5 more minutes of screen time to go over the revenue projections. He argued that since he had purchased the top-tier premium Wi-Fi package, he legally owned a percentage of the ship's bandwidth and was entitled to utilize the audio-visual equipment for remote work. The technician, completely unfazed by the bribe, yanked the cord, restoring the superhero movie to thunderous applause. A normal person would retreat in shame. Greg, however, simply pivoted his strategy. Realizing he had briefly captured the attention of hundreds of potential investors, he spent the next 2 hours wading through the main pool in his designer swim trunks, aggressively handing out waterproof business cards. He approached random strangers eating nachos on their sun loungers, loudly asking if they had any questions about the Q3 pie chart they had just seen, entirely convinced he had just executed the most brilliant guerrilla marketing campaign in maritime history. He eventually left a 1-star review for the cruise line, stating their conference facilities were far too damp and the attendees were severely underdressed. 7. You probably assume the thermal suite in a cruise ship spa is strictly meant to be a shared sanctuary of quiet relaxation, featuring heated ceramic loungers and aromatic steam rooms. Valerie, a high-end real estate developer from Newport Beach, viewed the phrase shared sanctuary as a hilarious oxymoron. Having purchased a premium week-long spa pass, she determined that the entire facility was essentially the master bathroom of her floating penthouse. On the morning of day 4, she marched into the glass-enclosed eucalyptus steam room, carrying not a towel, but a custom monogram tote bag filled with unauthorized provisions. Finding two women quietly enjoying the steam, Valerie politely, yet firmly, informed them that the room had been booked for a private corporate wellness retreat, and they needed to vacate the premises immediately. Bewildered by her sheer authority, the women left. Valerie then proceeded to pull a heavy-duty rubber door wedge from her bag, jamming it firmly under the heavy glass door to effectively barricade herself inside. She seamlessly transformed the public steam room into her personal dining suite, unpacking a smuggled bottle of chilled Pinot Grigio and a lavish, highly perishable charcuterie board, laying the imported meats and artisanal cheeses directly onto the 104-degree heated ceramic tiles. It took the spa staff 20 minutes to realize why a line of angry passengers in bathrobes was forming outside the locked glass box. When the spa manager knocked on the glass, gesturing wildly to the door, Valerie simply smiled, tapped her waterproof watch, and held up a handwritten sign she had brought from home that read, "Do not disturb, executive wellness session." The manager had to call the engineering maintenance team to physically pry the door wedge loose with a crowbar. As the thick, humid air cleared, revealing a catastrophic mess of melted Gouda and warm prosciutto plastered to the luxury tiles, Valerie didn't apologize. Instead, she stood up, wrapped her towel like a Roman toga, and aggressively demanded the manager provide a complimentary deep tissue massage to compensate for the fact that the ship's irregular swaying had caused her wine to spill into the floor drain. She firmly believed the cruise line owed her a brand new block of aged cheddar because their steam room was entirely the wrong temperature for storing delicate dairy. 8. Maritime law dictates that every passenger, regardless of how much they paid for their cabin, must attend the mandatory safety muster drill before the ship sets sail. It is a fundamental, non-negotiable exercise in survival. For Lawrence, an investment banker from Manhattan, standing shoulder to shoulder with the general public in a hot theater while wearing a neon orange life jacket was simply a gross violation of his lifestyle. When the ship's alarms sounded, signaling everyone to report to their assembly stations, Lawrence decided to skip the peasant parade entirely. He strolled up to the ship's chief safety officer in the main lobby, bypassing a crowd of anxious families, and calmly handed the man his black platinum credit card. Without a hint of irony, Lawrence requested to be immediately upgraded to the premium evacuation package. The officer stared at him blankly as Lawrence explained that in the event of the ship striking an iceberg, he absolutely refused to be crammed into a standard fiberglass lifeboat with people who drank cheap beer. He demanded a private VIP emergency raft, preferably one with leather seating, a functioning minibar, and a priority boarding lane during the sinking process. When the deeply exhausted officer informed him that survival at sea is a completely classless endeavor, Lawrence scoffed, retrieved his credit card, and announced he would simply stay in his suite and await a private helicopter rescue because he didn't do communal emergencies. He spent the entire drill sitting alone at the martini bar, sipping a gin fizz, utterly convinced his net worth made him naturally buoyant. 9. Picture a level of delusion so profound that it borders on abstract performance art. Enter Victoria, a retired regional theater actress from Boca Raton, who booked a grand suite and instantly determined that the ship's signature piano lounge was, in fact, her own private cabaret venue. Arriving at the wood-paneled lounge at 7 in the evening, Victoria didn't just request a song from the resident musician. She marched up to the grand piano, unrolled a massive leather-bound binder of obscure 1940s sheet music, and set up a professional-grade, battery-powered ring light directly on the polished lid. While the actual ship's pianist was mid-sip of his water, she plugged her own vintage vocal microphone into a portable amplifier she had smuggled aboard and handed him a crisp $100 bill, informing him that he was now her exclusive accompanist. When the bewildered musician explained he had a strict corporate set list to follow, Victoria simply shooed him off the bench with her hands, declaring that true maritime elegance required a classical soprano. She then systematically went around the room and physically unplugged 3 neon decorative signs because the blue ambient lighting was ruining her complexion. Her hostile takeover escalated beautifully when she recruited her remarkably submissive husband, a man who looked like he hadn't spoken since 1998, to stand at the main entrance doors holding a velvet rope they had detached from the nearby casino. She instructed him to charge passing passengers a 2-drink minimum cover fee to enter the lounge and listen to her vocal warm-ups. For 20 minutes, Victoria actually held the room hostage, delivering a breathless, unprompted monologue about her understudy role in a 1985 production of Cats, before aggressively yelling at the bartender to cease all blender operations because the crushed ice frequency was damaging her pitch. The sheer, aggressive confidence of a woman in a sequined gown screaming at a blender actually kept the security team at bay for a moment, simply because they assumed she was an eccentric guest entertainer hired by the cruise line. But the brilliant twist came when Victoria got into a furious argument with herself over the tempo of a Gershwin tune. She threw her hands up, loudly fired the imaginary pianist in her head, and stormed out of the lounge, announcing she was returning to her suite to retrieve her pristine backing tracks on her iPad, promising the utterly confused crowd a true Broadway experience. During her 20-minute absence, the cruise director's staff finally arrived to prepare the room for its actual scheduled event, the 8 o'clock evening comedy roast. By the time Victoria returned, bursting through the doors in a massive, authentic feather boa and striking a dramatic pose in the doorway, the room was packed with 300 rowdy passengers. She strutted to the center of the floor, expecting thunderous applause for her triumphant return. Instead, she walked directly into the crosshairs of a deeply cynical, incredibly sharp stand-up comedian who immediately assumed her extravagant entrance was a gift from the comedy gods. The comedian paused his set, locked eyes with her, and spent the next 45 minutes relentlessly, surgically roasting her feather boa, her dramatic makeup, and her obvious entitlement, while the massive crowd roared with deafening laughter. Because the lounge was entirely packed, Victoria physically could not reach the exit without crossing the stage again, forcing her to sit rigidly in a front-row chair, utterly humiliated, enduring an hour of savage jokes in the exact room she had tried to conquer. 10. An expensive bottle of wine is a lovely vacation indulgence, but for Winston, a hedge fund manager from Connecticut, a $2,000 vintage was essentially a leash he could use to walk the ship's sommelier. After purchasing the most expensive Bordeaux in the specialty steakhouse, Winston decided that the sommelier was now his private, indentured butler for the remainder of the evening. He firmly demanded that the impeccably dressed wine expert follow him out of the restaurant and trail exactly 3 paces behind him across the ship, carrying the bottle in a silver ice bucket and pouring him a sip whenever he snapped his fingers. When the incredibly patient sommelier politely explained that his duties strictly kept him inside the dining room, Winston was appalled. Refusing to pour his own beverage like a peasant, Winston purchased a wheeled silver champagne stand, tied the belt of his plush cabin bathrobe around its base, and proceeded to drag the heavy bucket around the massive ship behind him like a metallic golden retriever. He spent the entire night clanking through the casino and the promenade, violently yanking the leash and snapping at anyone who walked too close to his trailing vintage. His aristocratic illusion abruptly ended when he arrogantly dragged his makeshift pet onto a glass-bottomed observation elevator. The tiny brass wheels of the bucket caught perfectly in the elevator door track, instantly tipping the heavy silver stand sideways and sending $2,000 of premium Bordeaux cascading entirely down the elevator shaft, leaving Winston frantically trying to slurp the remnants off his own designer loafers before the doors closed. 11. Formal night on a cruise is traditionally an evening for couples to take a nice photo by the grand staircase, but Diane from Calabasas viewed the multi-deck crystal Atrium strictly as the set of her personal Vogue editorial shoot. Having booked a premium suite, she felt the cruise line's standard photographers lacked the necessary vision to capture her family's matching velvet outfits. So, at 6 in the evening, right when 3,000 hungry people were trying to navigate down to the main dining room, Diane deployed a tactical blockade. She brought 2 massive, collapsible professional lighting umbrellas from her luggage, erecting them directly in the center of the grand staircase landing. She then positioned her deeply exhausted brother-in-law at the top of with a battery-operated leaf blower to provide a continuous, dramatic wind effect for her hair. When passengers inevitably tried to walk down the stairs to eat their dinner, Diane didn't just ask them to wait. She screamed, "You're in the frame!" with the furious intensity of a Hollywood director losing sunlight. She literally instructed her husband to string a roll of yellow caution tape across the brass handrails, essentially holding the entire culinary schedule of the ship hostage so she could find her perfect angle. Whenever someone managed to squeeze past the caution tape, Diane would dramatically lower her camera, sigh heavily, and use a notepad to write down their cabin numbers, loudly declaring she was going to invoice them for ruining her composition. She successfully gridlocked the central artery of a billion-dollar megaship for 40 minutes. Security was in the process of dismantling her photography studio when maritime physics intervened. A passenger on the deck directly above the Atrium, holding a massive overloaded plate of barbecue ribs from the casual buffet, bumped into a doorway. A single, perfectly glazed, incredibly sticky pork rib slipped off the edge of the plate, plummeted silently through the open atrium space, and landed with a wet, devastating smack directly onto Diane's pristine white silk gown, just as the camera flashed. The resulting photograph immortalized the exact millisecond her private fashion fantasy transformed into a permanent barbecue stain. 12. It takes a highly refined type of arrogance to look at a working commercial crew of 2,000 people and decide they are simply your unassigned personal entourage. This brings us to Richard, an e-commerce magnate who found the physical act of walking around a 16-deck megaship to be profoundly undignified. Realizing the ship did not offer private golf carts for interior hallways, Richard decided to construct a human palanquin ecosystem out of the ship's staff. On day 2, he approached 3 off-duty waiters near the buffet and offered them each $500 in cash for a very specific set of off-book duties. He essentially created his own royal procession. Waiter number 1 was assigned to walk exactly 10 feet ahead of Richard at all times, physically parting the crowds and holding elevator doors open. Waiter number 2 was tasked with carrying Richard's incredibly tiny, yet apparently heavy designer sunglasses case and a single bottle of sparkling water. Waiter number 3 had the most crucial job, walking slightly to the left and aiming a high-powered, battery-operated misting fan directly at Richard's face while he strolled across the pool deck. Richard treated the public spaces like he was touring his own private estate, casually tossing crumpled napkins to his rented staff and speaking to them entirely through a walkie-talkie he had purchased at the port, even though they were standing 2 feet away. He even sent the lead waiter to the casual dining room an hour early, just to physically stand guard over a specific tray of premium shrimp cocktail until Richard arrived. The sheer audacity of a man walking through a crowded casino with a personal misting handler and a crowd clearer was staggering, and it was entirely depleting the ship's workforce. The cruise director noticed the missing staff and was preparing to shut down Richard's rogue employment agency, but Richard's ego caused his own spectacular downfall before management even had to speak to him. On the final sea day, Richard decided his entourage was missing a critical element: a human media stand. He wanted to watch an action movie on his iPad while soaking in the crowded main hot tub, but he didn't want to get his arms wet. Spotting a very stern-looking man in a crisp, unmarked polo shirt drinking coffee nearby, Richard swaggered over, pulled out a thick wad of cash, and offered the stranger $300 just to stand at the edge of the bubbling water and hold the iPad at eye level for 2 hours. The man looked at the cash, looked at Richard's 3 trailing waiters, smiled thinly, and politely accepted the job. He stood there for the entire movie while Richard gloated to the other passengers about how wealth can buy any convenience in the world. The devastating twist occurred the following morning when the ship finally docked in Miami. Richard, expecting to waltz off the ship with his entourage carrying his bags, was instead immediately intercepted at the gangway by a squad of federal officers. The man in the polo shirt, who had dutifully held the iPad, was not a random passenger. He was an undercover maritime customs and border protection agent traveling on official deployment. The agent had spent the entire cruise observing Richard casually pulling massive wads of undeclared cash from his pockets to bribe the crew, flagging him as a premier money laundering and smuggling risk. Richard was escorted to a windowless concrete room on the pier, where he spent 6 agonizing hours watching heavily armed officers and 3 drug-sniffing dogs systematically dismantle every single piece of his designer luggage, while his former rented entourage walked happily past the security windows, waving goodbye to the man who thought he owned the ocean. There is a fascinating psychological leap that happens when someone books a premium suite on a 5,000-passenger vessel. They genuinely confuse a high-end ticket with a private yacht charter, trying to privately manage public real estate. Which of these fake yacht owners do you think had the most embarrassing reality check? Drop your pick below. Subscribe to watch more massive egos hit reality.